I never imagined that my stepson would do this, but that one moment changed everything. What happens when the line between trust and betrayal blurs, threatening to unravel a family? The secret I tried to bury was bound to come out, and now I'm left wondering, can love survive when the bonds are tested to their breaking point? Stay with me to uncover the truth behind this forbidden chapter of my life. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and share where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. I never imagined that my stepson would do this. When I walked into the dimly lit kitchen that evening, the sight before me was enough to steal my breath. My heart pounded against my chest as I froze, unsure whether to turn around or confront the tension head on. I knew that moment would change everything, but what I didn't realize was just how deeply it would unravel my life. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as I stood at the kitchen island, scrolling through my phone. My husband, David, was away on yet another business trip, leaving the house quiet and cavernous. It wasn't unusual. This was our routine. He worked tirelessly, providing for us, though his absence often felt like an unspoken agreement that his career mattered more than anything else, even us. I glanced out the window at the fading sunlight and the crisp autumn leaves scattered across the lawn. The soft hum of the dishwasher and the rhythmic ticking of the clock were the only sounds in the house. It should have been comforting, but instead it felt oppressive, like the silence had grown teeth and was gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Nathan, my 22-year-old stepson, had moved back home temporarily after finishing his undergraduate degree. His presence brought a mix of emotions I couldn't quite parse. David's son from his first marriage was strikingly handsome, with the kind of confidence that came naturally to someone his age. I often caught myself wondering how two people, David and Nathan, could share blood yet feel like polar opposites. Fascinated where David was pragmatic and distant, Nathan was magnetic and warm, his charm as effortless as his smile. He wore a cravat. That day, Nathan had spent most of his time in the den, headphones clamped over his ears while he worked on something for his grad school applications. I'd passed by a few times, trying to suppress the subtle pull I felt whenever he was around. It was a feeling I didn't dare name, a confusing blend of admiration and something much darker. Hey. It wasn't the first time I noticed him. How could I not? Nathan had a way of commanding attention without trying. He'd smile at me across the dinner table, ask how my day was, and somehow his kindness made me feel seen in ways David's practicality never did. But I was his stepmother. The lines were clear, and I knew better than to cross them. Or so I thought. That evening, I decided to cook dinner for us, something simple yet comforting. As I diced vegetables for a stir-fry, I heard Nathan's voice behind me. Need any help? Startled, I turned around, knife in hand. He was leaning against the doorway, his frame relaxed yet commanding. His tousled hair and casual hoodie gave him a boyish charm that betrayed the sharpness in his eyes. Help? From you? I teased, trying to mask the unease I felt. I didn't know you were interested in cooking. What's about to happen? I asked, whispering into his ear. His eyes closed as he approached my bed. You've been in my thoughts too much lately and I've worn terriers from the liver. I'm sorry for my son. I hesitated, but handed him a chopping board and some vegetables. Fine, but don't complain if your fingers get nicked. He laughed, a low, rich sound that filled the room. Deal. For a while we worked side by side in comfortable silence. Occasionally our hands would brush as we reached for the same utensil, each time sending an unspoken current between us. I told myself it was nothing. that I was imagining the spark. But when I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my stomach flip. The way his gaze lingered on me, as if studying the curve of my face, the line of my jaw. As we sat down to eat, Nathan asked me about my life before I met David. It was an innocent question, but the way he leaned forward, genuinely interested, made me falter. My past wasn't something I often discussed, especially not with someone like Nathan, who had a way of peeling back the layers with just a look. "Well," I began, twirling a forkful of noodles, "I worked in marketing for a while. It was demanding, but I loved the creativity of it." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And then you met my dad." "Yes," I said, smiling faintly. "Then I met your dad." There was an edge to his voice when he spoke next. "You don't talk much about him, about how you two are." The question caught me off guard. It wasn't accusatory, but it was probing in a way that made me uncomfortable. "David and I are fine. He's a good provider, a good husband." Nathan arched an eyebrow. "Good provider, huh? That's one way to describe him?" "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, half laughing to diffuse the tension. "Nothing," he said quickly, leaning back in his chair. "Just, I know my dad. He's a great businessman, sure, but as a husband, I mean, I've seen how hard you try to make this house a home. It doesn't go unnoticed, you know." His words felt like a spotlight, illuminating cracks in the facade I'd worked so hard to maintain. He reached across the table, his hand brushing mine lightly. "I mean it. You deserve more credit than you get." I say. The rest of the evening was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, though I couldn't put it into words. After dinner, I cleaned up while Nathan disappeared upstairs. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt charged, like the air before a storm. Hours later, I climbed into bed, exhausted yet restless. David had called earlier, his voice distant as he recounted the day's meetings. "Just a few more days," he'd said before hanging up. It was always just a few more days. As I lay staring at the ceiling, I heard footsteps outside my door. They paused, then moved on, retreating down the hall. My pulse quickened, though I couldn't explain why. The next morning, I found Nathan in the living room, reading a book. He looked up as I entered, his smile as easy as ever. "Morning." "Morning," I replied, my voice tinged with uncertainty. "Sleep well?" he asked, closing the book. He hesitated, then nodded. "As well as I could." His eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching. "Good." There was something in the way he said it, something that made me wonder if he'd been the one outside my door. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself I was imagining things. Whatever was happening between us, it was my responsibility to stop it before it began. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. I tried to ignore the charged undercurrent between Nathan and me, burying myself in household chores and video calls with David. But it was impossible to escape the pull of his presence, the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his voice softened when he asked if I needed help. It all felt deliberate, though unspoken. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into Nathan's kindness. After all, he was my stepson. This was ridiculous. Yet, as the days turned into nights, I couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze, like a secret he wanted to tell but couldn't. One afternoon, I was in the garden, pruning the overgrown bushes near the patio. The late autumn air was cool but not biting, and the golden light filtered through the trees in a way that felt almost magical. I heard the back door creak open and turned to see Nathan stepping out, a steaming mug in his hand. "Thought you might want this," he said, holding it out to me. I hesitated, wiping my hands on my gardening apron before taking the mug. "Thank you, that's sweet of you." He shrugged, leaning against the wooden post of the pergola. "You've been out here for hours. Figured you could use a break." I sipped the tea, the warmth spreading through me. "It's peaceful out here," I said, more to myself than to him. "Sometimes I think I need moments like this, just to feel grounded." Nathan tilted his head, studying me. "Is that because of my dad?" I froze, the mug halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" He shifted, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. It just seems like you're always holding everything together. For him, for this house, for us." "Nathan," I began, setting the mug down on the patio table, "it's not like that. Your dad works hard. He..." "I'm not saying he doesn't," Nathan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. I don't think he sees how much you do, how much you give." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't that he was wrong. There were truths in his statement that I'd been avoiding for years. But hearing them from him, from Nathan, felt like crossing an invisible line. "I don't know what you're trying to say," I finally managed, my voice quieter than I intended. "And just saying, you deserve to feel seen, to feel appreciated," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. Something about the way he said it, the weight of his tone, the intensity of his gaze, made my stomach twist. I looked away, focusing on the leaves scattered across the patio. "Nathan, I think you should go inside," I said, my voice firmer now. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Okay. I'm sorry if I overstepped." "Okay." As he walked back into the house, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands trembled as I picked up the pruning shears, but I couldn't focus. His words, his gaze, they lingered, pressing against the walls of my mind. That evening, I avoided Nathan as much as I could. I stayed in the kitchen long after dinner was done, cleaning countertops that were already spotless. When I finally ventured into the living room, he was sprawled on the couch, headphones on, engrossed in something on his laptop. He didn't look up as I passed, but I felt his presence like a magnetic pull, drawing me closer, even as I tried to resist. The house felt unbearably small that night. I retreated to my bedroom early, hoping that sleep would bring clarity. But my dreams were restless, filled with fragments of conversations and lingering touches that I couldn't escape. The next day, I woke early, determined to shake off the strange energy that had settled over the house. I decided to tackle the attic, a space I'd been meaning to organize for months. The sunlight streamed through the small window as I sifted through old boxes, losing myself in the monotony of sorting. I was so engrossed that I didn't hear Nathan come up the stairs. When I finally looked up, he was standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Need some help?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "I'm fine," I said quickly, returning my attention to the box in front of me. He didn't leave. Instead, he stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. "You shouldn't be up here alone. It's dusty and cramped. Let me at least carry some of these boxes down for you." "Nathan, I said I'm fine," I repeated, though my voice lacked conviction. He crouched beside me, his gaze level with mine. You don't have to do everything alone, you know. There it was again. That same intensity. That same unspoken connection that both terrified and intrigued me. I looked away, focusing on the pile of books in front of me. You're persistent, I'll give you that, I muttered, trying to inject some levity into the moment. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. I just want to help. For a while we worked side by side in silence. I tried to ignore the way his presence made the small room feel impossibly intimate, the way my pulse quickened whenever our hands accidentally brushed. At one point, he reached for a heavy box, his arm brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I pulled back quickly, pretending to adjust the scarf around my neck. Are you okay? He asked, his brow furrowing. I'm fine, I said, my voice a little too sharp. He hesitated, then nodded. Okay, if you say so. But the concern in his eyes didn't fade. And as I watched him lift the box and carry it down the stairs, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something I wasn't sure I had the strength to resist. As he climbed the stairs, I faced that first hour of the night. That evening, the tension reached a breaking point. Nathan and I were in the living room, the television on, but neither of us paying attention. He sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked at me. I need to say something, he began, his voice steady but low. Now, Nathan, I started, but he held up a hand. Are you just... Let me say this, he said. I know this is wrong. I know we shouldn't even be having this conversation. But I can't keep pretending like I don't feel something for you. His words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for a response. This isn't appropriate, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. You're my stepson, Nathan. I know, he said, his eyes searching mine. And I hate that I feel this way, but I can't help it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, charged with emotions I couldn't name. I think you should go to bed, I said finally, my voice trembling. He nodded, standing slowly. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. As he walked away, I felt a mix of relief and something else. Something I didn't want to acknowledge. Because the truth was, part of me didn't want him to leave. The days following Nathan's confession were a blur of tension and avoidance. I kept myself busy, finding every excuse to stay out of the house or lock myself in my room. I tried to convince myself that his words had been a fleeting moment of vulnerability, something we could both move past without consequence. But deep down, I knew better. Nathan wasn't just a young man speaking out of turn. There was a depth to his feelings, an intensity that lingered in the way he looked at me, the way his presence filled the room, even when he said nothing. It was as if he'd pulled back a curtain, exposing a truth I'd been too afraid to see. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I sat on the patio with a glass of wine. The crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and for a moment I allowed myself to relax. But the reprieve was short-lived. Nathan stepped outside, his footsteps soft against the wooden deck. Mind if I join you? I hesitated, then gestured to the chair opposite me. Sure. He sat down, his posture relaxed, yet his gaze intent. You've been avoiding me. I laughed nervously, swirling the wine in my glass. "I've been busy." "You've been avoiding me," he repeated, his voice gentle but firm. I sighed, setting the glass down. "Nathan, what you said the other night, it wasn't appropriate. We need to move past it." "And what if I can't?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "What if I don't want to?" His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. "You don't mean that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're young and you're confused." "I'm not confused," he interrupted, his tone steady. "I know how I feel, and I know it's wrong, but I also know I can't stop thinking about you." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. "Nathan, this can't happen. It's not just wrong. It's destructive. To you, to me, to your father." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent every waking moment telling myself to stop? But I can't. And I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a physical blow, the truth of them cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the wooden deck. "I am going inside." He didn't stop me, but his gaze followed me, heavy and full of unspoken emotions. As I stepped into the house, I felt like I was leaving part of myself behind. The following morning, I woke early, determined to regain control of the situation. I busied myself with chores, scrubbing surfaces that didn't need cleaning, and reorganizing cabinets that were already perfectly arranged. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the weight of Nathan's presence. Late in the afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, preparing lunch. He looked up as I entered, a small smile playing on his lips. "Hungry?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, though my stomach betrayed me with a loud growl. He laughed softly, pulling out a chair. "Sit. I made extra." I hesitated, then sat down. He placed a plate in front of me, a simple sandwich and some chips, but it felt like a peace offering. "Thank you," I murmured, picking at the edges of the bread. We ate in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "You know, you don't have to keep pushing me away." I looked up, meeting his gaze. "Nathan, this isn't a game. This is serious, and it has to stop." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I'm not playing games. I've never been more serious about anything in my life." The intensity in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't understand what you're saying. The consequences of this, they're too much." "Maybe," he said quietly, "but maybe some things are worth the risk." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "I won't." He didn't try to stop me as I walked away, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. And as much as I wanted to shut him out, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, that no matter how hard I tried, something had already shifted between us, something I couldn't undo. "You were here." That evening, I called David, desperate for a sense of normalcy. But as always, he was busy. His voice was distant, distracted, as he rattled off the details of his latest business deal. I tried to tell him about the house, about my day, but he barely listened. When we finally hung up, I felt more alone than ever. As I sat in the living room, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me, Nathan appeared in the doorway. "You okay?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He crossed the room, sitting down beside me. "You can talk to me, you know." I shook my head, staring at the floor. I don't think that's a good idea. I thought. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't keep pretending like I don't care. I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something raw in his eyes, something that made my chest ache. Nathan, it's not about what we want. It's about what's right. Sometimes, he said quietly, those aren't the same thing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with emotions I couldn't name. Finally, he stood, his shoulders slumping. I'll give you space, he said softly, for I'm not going anywhere. As he walked away, I felt a mix of relief and something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge, because the truth was, part of me didn't want him to leave. His presence made me feel safe. The tension between Nathan and me had grown into something alive, filling every corner of the house with its presence. I couldn't ignore it anymore, no matter how hard I tried. Each glance, each fleeting touch, each unspoken word seemed to pull us closer to a breaking point. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. It was a rainy evening when it all came to a head. The sky outside was dark, the relentless patter of rain against the windows a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. David had called earlier to let me know he would be extending his trip by another week. He didn't offer much of an explanation, and I didn't press him for one. The space between us had grown vast, and I no longer had the energy to bridge it. I poured myself a glass of wine, trying to unwind, but the house felt suffocatingly quiet. I was about to retreat to my room when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Nathan standing in the doorway, his damp hair sticking to his forehead from a run he had apparently just returned from. "You're soaked," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged, stepping into the kitchen. "It's just water. Why don't you go dry off before you catch a cold?" I suggested, avoiding his gaze. But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his piercing eyes locked on mine. Are we just going to keep pretending? Or are we going to talk about this? My chest tightened and I set the glass down, suddenly too restless to sit. There's nothing to talk about. That's not true and you know it, he said, his voice steady but insistent. This thing between us, it's not going away. I shook my head, pacing to the other side of the room. Nathan, stop. You don't know what you're saying. This isn't right. Maybe not, he said, taking a step closer. But it's real, and I think it's about time we stopped running from it. I'm not running, I said, though the words felt hollow. I'm trying to protect you. To protect us. From what? He asked, his voice rising slightly. From feeling something? From being honest about what's happening here? I turned to face him, my emotions boiling over. From ruining everything. Don't you see that? If anyone found out, if your father found out, this would destroy us all. Nathan stepped closer, his expression softening. I don't care what people think. I care about you. His words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He was standing so close now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My resolve wavered as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Nathan, please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for. I can't pretend anymore, he said, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't name. I don't want to. Oh, Before I could stop him, his lips were on mine, soft and tentative, yet electrifying. I froze, my mind screaming at me to pull away, but my body betrayed me. The kiss deepened, and for a moment I let myself get lost in it, in the warmth of his touch, the way he held me as if I were something fragile and precious. But reality came crashing back, and I pushed him away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. No, this is wrong. Nathan looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said quietly. "Tell me this means nothing to you, and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the truth was, I couldn't. I couldn't deny the pull between us, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But that didn't make it right. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I won't." He took a step back, his expression a mixture of hurt and understanding. "Okay," he said softly. "But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart pounding and my mind racing. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and guilt. I avoided Nathan as much as I could, throwing myself into anything that would keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The feel of his lips on mine. The way he'd looked at me as if I was the only person in the world. It was a cruel irony. The very thing I was running from was the one thing I couldn't escape. One night, I found myself standing outside Nathan's door, my hand raised to knock. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I couldn't keep going on like this. But before I could summon the courage, the door opened and there he was, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice trembling. "About us. About what happened." Nathan sat down beside me, careful to keep some distance, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "You're right. There is something between us. Something I can't ignore, no matter how hard I try." His eyes softened and he reached out, taking my hand in his. "You don't have to fight it anymore." "But I do," I said, pulling my hand away, "because this isn't just about us. It's about your father. It's about this family. If we do this, if we cross this line, there's no going back." Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and filled with determination. "I'm willing to take that risk. For you." His words broke something in me, and before I knew it, I was kissing him again, all my fear and hesitation melting away in the heat of the moment. It was reckless and selfish and completely wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. "Come." This time, I didn't pull away. The hours that followed were a blur of passion and regret, of stolen moments and whispered confessions. For the first time in years, I felt truly alive, as if I was rediscovering a part of myself I'd long forgotten. But as the sun began to rise, reality came crashing back. I lay in Nathan's arms, my mind racing with the weight of what we'd done. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal of everything I'd built, of the life I'd promised to uphold. And yet, a small part of me couldn't bring itself to regret it. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we can't let this happen again." He tightened his hold on me, his voice steady and resolute. "I don't want to lose you. I don't." "You never had me," I said, though the words felt like a lie. "This has to end." He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to let go. And as I slipped out of bed and returned to my room, I realized I wasn't sure if I was either. The morning after my night with Nathan was a whirlwind of guilt and panic. The sunlight streamed through the windows, harsh and unforgiving, as if the world itself was condemning me. I stood in the shower far longer than necessary, hoping the hot water could wash away the weight of what had happened. But no matter how much I scrubbed, the memory of his touch, his lips, and his whispered words lingered. By the time I emerged, the house was eerily quiet. I avoided the kitchen, unsure if I could face him, and instead made myself busy with mundane tasks. But every corner of the house seemed to hold a reminder of him. The lingering scent of his cologne in the hallway, the faint sound of his footsteps as he moved about the house. Even the couch seemed to mock me, a silent witness to the tension that had built between us. That afternoon, I decided to confront the reality of what I'd done. I couldn't hide forever, and pretending everything was normal only made the weight of my guilt heavier. Taking a deep breath, I found Nathan in the den, sitting on the couch with his laptop open. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. He closed his laptop, setting it aside. "I'm listening." I hesitated, the words tangling in my throat. "What happened last night? It can't happen again." He nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something hurt, defiance in his eyes. "I figured you'd say that." "It's not about what I want," I continued, my voice trembling. "It's about what's right. What we did was wrong, Nathan. It was a betrayal of your father, of this family." "And what about you?" he asked, his voice quiet but pointed. "What about how you feel?" "How I feel doesn't matter," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Nathan stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. "That's a lie, and you know it." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Please, Nathan, let's just move on. Pretend it never happened." "And what if I can't?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "What if I don't want to?" His words pierced through me, and for a moment I wavered, but I forced myself to stay firm. "You have to. We both do." Beside me, Effie said. For the next few days, I tried to avoid Nathan as much as possible. I threw myself into every task I could think of, cleaning, organizing, even rearranging the furniture in the guest room, anything to keep myself busy, to keep my mind from wandering back to him. But no matter how hard I tried, he was always there, lingering in the edges of my thoughts. And then David came home. I'd thought his return would bring some sense of normalcy, that his presence would act as a buffer between Nathan and me. But instead, it only heightened the tension in the house. Every glance, every passing interaction felt like a test, as if the walls themselves were waiting to reveal our secret. David, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, fell back into his usual routine. He spent his days in his office and his evenings on the phone, his focus always elsewhere. I tried to act normal, to be the supportive wife he expected me to be, but it was a performance that grew harder with each passing day. Nathan, on the other hand, seemed less inclined to pretend. His presence was quieter, more withdrawn, but when our eyes met, the weight of what we'd shared hung between us, unspoken, but undeniable. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, David called out from his office. "Honey, can you grab my briefcase from the den?" "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. I walked into the den, only to find Nathan there, sprawled on the couch with a book in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening when he saw me. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the briefcase. "Hi." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, I grabbed the briefcase and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. I froze, my back to him. "What?" "With him," he said, sitting up. "Are you happy?" I turned slowly, my chest tightening. "Nathan, that's not a fair question." "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady, "but it's an honest one." I looked away, my fingers tightening around the handle of the briefcase. "It doesn't matter." I heard a muffled pant in the distance. Jerry came home. "It does to me," he said, standing. "You deserve to be happy, to feel loved." "I am loved," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Your father loves me." "Does?" he asked. Nathan asked, his voice soft but cutting. "When was the last time he really looked at you, really saw you?" I shook my head, my throat tightening. "Stop, please." Nathan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I see you every day, and I know you feel it too, no matter how much you try to deny it." Tears burned in my eyes as I shook my head. This has to stop, Nathan. You have to stop." "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't stop loving you." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. David was preoccupied with his work, barely glancing up from his plate. Nathan, on the other hand, was silent, but watchful, his gaze flickering to me every so often. I avoided his eyes, focusing on the mundane task of cutting my food into small, precise pieces. After dinner, David retreated to his office, leaving me alone in the kitchen to clean up. I was stacking dishes in the sink when Nathan appeared in the doorway. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. I shook my head, not looking at him. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said, stepping closer. "You're breaking, and I hate watching it." I turned to face him, my hands trembling. "Nathan, please, don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm not trying to," he said, his voice raw. "I just want to help you." "You can't," I said, my voice breaking. "No one can." For a moment, he just stood there, his expression torn. Then, slowly, he reached out and took my hands in his. His touch was gentle, grounding, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said softly. "I'm here." Tears welled in my eyes and I nodded, unable to speak. For a brief moment, I let myself lean into him, let myself feel the comfort of his presence. But then the weight of reality crashed down, and I pulled away. "I can't do this," I whispered, wiping my eyes. "I can't." He nodded, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. Each day felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the inevitable moment when the fragile facade would crack and everything would come tumbling down. I'd avoided Nathan as much as I could, throwing myself into any task that would keep me occupied. But no matter how far I ran, the guilt followed me like a shadow. David, oblivious as ever, continued his routine of long work hours and late nights. His absence should have brought relief, but instead, it only deepened the chasm between us. I couldn't tell if he noticed the growing tension in the house, or if he simply didn't care. One evening, David surprised me by coming home early. I was in the living room folding laundry when he walked in, his tie loosened and his expression weary. "Hey," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Figured I'd take a night off from the office." I forced a smile, though my heart raced in my chest. "That's nice." He leaned down to kiss my cheek, the gesture familiar but devoid of warmth. "What's for dinner?" "I'll whip something up," I said, standing quickly. "Why don't you relax?" As I busied myself in the kitchen, I felt the weight of his presence in the next room. It had been weeks since we'd had a real conversation, and the idea of sitting across from him at dinner felt unbearable, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Nathan came downstairs just as I was setting the table. His eyes met mine briefly before flickering to David, who was pouring himself a drink at the counter. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. "Hey, Dad," Nathan said, his tone casual but strained. David turned, smiling. "Nathan, didn't realize you were still here. Thought you'd be out with friends." "Not tonight," Nathan replied, sitting down at the table. "Figured I'd stick around." I swallowed hard, placing the last of the dishes on the table. As we sat down to eat, the silence was deafening. Every clink of a fork against a plate felt magnified, each movement weighed down by the unspoken truths lurking just beneath the surface. My mouth dropped open, but I avoided saying. Halfway through the meal, David looked up, his brow furrowing. "Everything okay with you two? You've been awfully quiet." My heart skipped a beat and I forced a laugh. "Just tired, I guess." "It's been a long day." Nathan glanced at me, then back at David. "Yeah, everything's fine." But David didn't look convinced. He set down his fork, his gaze flickering between us. "Are you sure? Because it feels like there's something you're not telling me." "Try." Panic surged through me, and I quickly shook my head. "Of course not. Everything's fine." But Nathan, to my horror, didn't respond. He stared at his plate, his jaw tight, as if he were wrestling with something. David noticed, his expression hardening. "Nathan," he said, his voice firm, "is there something I need to know?" For a moment, the room was silent. Then Nathan looked up, his eyes meeting his father's. "Dad, Stop," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "Nathan, don't." David turned to me, his expression now a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on here?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My mind raced, desperate to find an explanation, an excuse, anything to diffuse the situation. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, in a moment of reckless bravery, or perhaps desperation, Nathan spoke. "It's my fault," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been struggling with feelings I shouldn't have. And I'm sorry if that's made things awkward around here." My breath caught in my throat and I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. David, however, looked more confused than ever. Finally, he spoke. "What kind of feelings?" he asked, his tone sharp. Nathan hesitated, then glanced at me. "Feelings for someone I shouldn't have. Someone who's off limits." You feel like I'm off limits? David's gaze shifted to me, his eyes narrowing. Off limits? What are you talking about? I shook my head, my hands trembling. David, it's not what you think. What I think, he interrupted, his voice rising. What am I supposed to think when my son starts talking about inappropriate feelings and then looks at my wife? The room fell deathly silent, the truth hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I felt like I was going to be sick. David, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I can explain. Can you? He demanded, his voice dripping with anger and betrayal. Because right now, it looks like the two of you have been hiding something from me. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Dad, stop. Don't blame her. This is my fault. David turned on him, his face red with fury. Your fault? What does that even mean? Are you telling me there's something going on between the two of you? No, I said quickly, my voice cracking. Nothing happened, but the look in David's eyes told me he didn't believe me. He turned away, running a hand through his hair as he let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. I can't believe this is happening. I took a step toward him, my hands outstretched. David, please, you have to believe me. Nothing happened. I would never... Would never what? He snapped, spinning to face me. Would never betray me, because right now it feels like you already have. Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. David's gaze hardened and he took a step back. I need some air, he said coldly, grabbing his coat and walking out the door. As the sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, I sank to the floor, my body trembling with sobs. Nathan knelt beside me, his expression filled with regret. I'm so sorry, he grinned. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean for this to happen. I looked at him, my chest aching with a mix of anger and despair. You should have stayed quiet. Now everything's ruined. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. David didn't come home, and I couldn't bring myself to call him. The weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, I realized just how much I'd risked and lost. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. The look of betrayal in David's eyes, the crack in Nathan's voice as he tried to take the blame, and the unbearable truth that no matter how hard I tried to keep it hidden, our secret was now out in the open, and there was no going back. The house was silent the next morning, an oppressive quiet that seemed to amplify the weight of everything that had happened. I'd barely slept the night before, replaying the confrontation over and over in my mind. David hadn't come home. I had called his phone several times, but it went straight to voicemail. The absence of his presence was a glaring reminder of the damage that had been done. Nathan stayed in his room, the door shut tight, leaving me alone with my guilt and the crushing silence. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with unspoken accusations. Every room a reminder of how deeply I'd betrayed the man I'd promised to love and honor. By the afternoon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I knocked on Nathan's door, hesitant but determined. After a moment, he opened it, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Can we talk? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. His room felt smaller than usual, the air heavy with tension. I sat on the edge of his bed, clasping my hands tightly in my lap. This has to stop, I began, my voice trembling. Whatever this is between us, It can't continue. Nathan sat in the chair by his desk, his shoulders slumped. I know, he said quietly, but that doesn't make it any easier. His mother stood next to him, staring into his face. I looked down at my hands, tears welling in my eyes. Your father deserves better. I've hurt him enough already. You didn't do this alone, Nathan said, his voice firm. I'm just as much to blame. That doesn't change the fact that I'm his wife, I said, my voice cracking. I made vows to him, vows that I broke the moment I let this happen. Nathan didn't respond, and the silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, I stood, wiping my eyes. I think it's best if you go back to campus, at least for a while. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. You're sending me away? I'm not sending you away, I said, though the words felt hollow. I just think we need space. Time to fix this. He stood, crossing the room to stand in front of me. And what if I don't want to go? What if I don't want to leave you? Nathan, please, I whispered, my voice breaking. This isn't about what we want, it's about what's right. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression torn. Then he nodded slowly, stepping back. I'll go, he said quietly, if that's what you want. It's what we need, I said, though my heart ached with the words. That evening, David finally came home. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and his eyes shadowed. He didn't say a word as he walked past me, heading straight to his office. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. David, I began, my voice trembling. I'm so sorry. He turned to face me, his expression cold and unreadable. Sorry for what? For lying to me? For betraying me? For everything, I said, tears streaming down my face. I never meant to hurt you. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Never meant to hurt me? How can you say that when you've been hiding this from me for God knows how long? It wasn't like that, I said quickly. Nothing happened between us. Not really. Not really? He repeated, his voice rising. What does that even mean? It means I made a mistake, I said, my voice breaking. A terrible, horrible mistake, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. David stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. Do you even love me? He asked finally, his voice quiet but filled with pain. Yes, I said without hesitation. Of course I do. Then why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you do this to me? To us? I don't know, I said, shaking my head. I wish I had an answer. But all I can do now is ask for your forgiveness and hope that we can find a way to move past this. David didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. The silence stretched on, each passing second an eternity. Finally, he let out a long sigh, running a hand over his face. I need time, he said quietly. Time to figure out if I can even look at you the same way again. I understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Take all the time you need. The next day, Nathan packed his things and left for campus. He didn't say much as he loaded his car, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. As he hugged me goodbye, his embrace lingered, filled with a mixture of regret and longing. Take care of yourself, he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. You too, I replied, my chest tightening. As I watched him drive away, a strange mix of relief and sorrow washed over me. I knew it was the right thing to do, but that didn't make it any less painful. Over the next few weeks, the house felt emptier than ever. David and I tiptoed around each other, our conversation strained and superficial. I tried to give him space, but the distance between us felt insurmountable. One evening, as we sat in the living room in silence, he finally spoke. "Do you think we can fix this?" I looked at him, my heart aching. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I want to try. If you'll let me." David nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." "After us?" I looked up. Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. That's all I can ask for. The road to rebuilding our marriage was long and filled with challenges. There were days when the weight of what I'd done felt unbearable, and nights when the silence between us was deafening. But little by little, we began to find our way back to each other. As for Nathan, I didn't see him again for months. He stayed away, giving us the space we needed to heal. And while a part of me would always carry the memory of what we'd shared, I knew it was a chapter that had to remain closed. Because in the end, love isn't just about passion or desire. It's about choice. And I was finally ready to choose the life I had, flaws and all. Months passed, and life gradually settled into an uneasy rhythm. David and I had made strides toward repairing our marriage, though the scars of what had happened lingered beneath the surface. We went to counseling, shared more meals together, and even started talking about plans for the future. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. For the first time in years, I felt like we were trying. Nathan, true to his word, stayed away. He texted occasionally, brief updates about school or to ask after David, but we both knew it was best to keep our distance. The house was quieter without him, emptier, and while I told myself it was for the best, there were moments, late at night, when the silence felt suffocating, that I missed him more than I cared to admit. One evening, as I was tidying up after dinner, David walked into the kitchen, his expression hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, leaning against the counter. I paused, the dish towel still in my hands. "What is it?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Nathan's coming home for the weekend. He called me this morning." The words sent a jolt through me, though I kept my expression neutral. "He said he wanted to talk," David continued, his tone cautious, "to clear the air." I nodded slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. "That's probably a good idea." David studied me for a moment, his gaze searching. "Are you going to be okay with this?" "Of course," I said quickly, though the lie felt heavy on my tongue. "It's been months. I think we're all ready to move forward." He nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. "I just thought you should know." "Thank you," I said softly, turning back to the sink. But as I stood there, rinsing plates under the stream of hot water, my mind raced. The thought of seeing Nathan again, of facing the weight of everything that had happened between us, left me feeling both anxious and unsteady. Nathan arrived late Friday evening. I was in the living room, curled up with a book, when I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart pounded as the door opened and he stepped inside, his familiar presence filling the space like a wave. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice warm but tinged with nervousness. David stood, pulling Nathan into a quick hug. "It's good to see you, son." "You too," Nathan replied, his gaze flickering to me. "Hi." "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "Welcome back." The words felt hollow, the tension between us palpable. But David either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, steering the conversation toward lighter topics as we all settled into the living room. I stayed mostly quiet, nodding along as they caught up, but I could feel Nathan's eyes on me every so often, the weight of his gaze a reminder of everything we'd left unsaid. Later that night, I was in the kitchen making tea when Nathan appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. Said Finch, looking over at me. I hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. David was in his office, the door closed, but the risk was still there. "Please," he said, stepping closer. "Just for a minute." I sighed, setting the kettle down. "Fine, what is it?" Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I folded my arms, trying to keep my emotions in check. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," he insisted. "I put you in an impossible position. I let my feelings get in the way, and I hurt you. I hurt my dad. I've spent the last few months trying to figure out how to fix it, and I realized the only thing I can do is own up to it." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Nathan, you're not the only one at fault. I made mistakes too." "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I don't regret how I feel about you. I can't. I looked away, my throat tightening. "You can't say things like that. Not anymore." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it doesn't change the truth." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. David appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. I took a step back, my heart racing. "We were just talking." David's gaze shifted between us, his jaw tightening. "Talking about what?" Nathan stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "Dad, it's not what you think." "And what exactly do I think?" David asked, his tone sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like nothing has changed." "David, please," I began, but he held up a hand. "No," he said firmly, his eyes fixed on Nathan. "I let this go once. I gave both of you the benefit of the doubt, but now I want the truth. All of it." Nathan hesitated, his hands clenching at his sides. "I love her," he said finally, his voice steady. "I've loved her for a long time." The room fell deathly silent, the weight of his words crashing down like a tidal wave. David stared at him, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. His eyes fell to both men. "You what?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Nathan said quickly. I didn't want to feel this way, but I can't help it." David turned to me, his eyes blazing. "And you? What about you?" I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "It's not what you think. Nothing happened." "Nothing?" David repeated, his voice rising. "He just stood here and admitted he's in love with you, and you're telling me nothing happened?" "I swear," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness, but I ended it before it could go any further." David let out a bitter laugh, his hands trembling. "A mistake? That's what you're calling it?" I took a step toward him, desperate to make him understand. "David, please. I love you. I've always loved you." "Don't," he said sharply, his voice cracking. "Don't you dare say that to me." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. the sound echoed through the house, leaving Nathan and me standing in the wreckage of our broken family. The days that followed were a blur of silence and heartbreak. David left for a business trip, though I suspected it was more about escaping than work. Nathan returned to campus, leaving behind only the faint echo of his presence. And I was left alone, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd destroyed. I didn't know if David would come back, or if our marriage could survive. All I knew was that I had made choices I couldn't undo, and the consequences were mine to bear. Because in the end, love and desire are never simple. They're messy, complicated, and sometimes they leave scars that never fully heal. Weeks turned into months, and the life I had carefully built felt like it was unraveling thread by thread. David returned home eventually, but his presence was different now. Cold, distant, as though a wall had been built between us that neither of us knew how to tear down. We were two people playing our roles, going through the motions of a marriage that had already fractured at its core. Nathan's absence hung in the air like a phantom. The house felt quieter without him, though his presence lingered in the smallest details. A book he'd left on the shelf, a jacket he forgot to pack, the faint trace of his cologne in the hallway. I tried to ignore it, to push him from my mind, but the memory of him, of his touch, his words, was a weight I couldn't seem to shake. One evening, David and I sat across from each other at the dinner table. The meal was silent, as it often was now, the clinking of silverware the only sound. I watched him as he pushed his food around on his plate, his expression distant. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Are we ever going to talk about this?" He looked up, his eyes cold and guarded. "What's there to talk about?" "Everything," I said, my voice trembling. "What happened? Where we go from here?" David set his fork down, leaning back in his chair. "You want to talk about it? Fine. Let's talk. You betrayed me. You betrayed our marriage. And now you're sitting here asking me where we go from here?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I'm trying, David. I'm trying to fix this." "And what if it's not fixable?" he asked, his voice rising. "What if some things are too broken to be repaired?" His words hit me like a slap, and I felt the sting of them deep in my chest. I had no response, no defense, because deep down, I feared he was right. David sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly, "but I also don't know if I'm ready to walk away." His words were both a comfort and a torment. They left the door open just enough to keep hope alive, but they also reminded me of how precarious our situation was. The balance of our marriage now hung on a thread, and neither of us knew which way it would sway. Weeks later, I received a message from Nathan. It was short, just a simple text. "I hope you're okay. I miss you." I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing. I knew I shouldn't respond, that any contact between us would only complicate things further. But the ache in my chest, the hollow emptiness that had been growing since he left, begged me to reach out. Finally, I typed a reply. "I'm okay. I hope you're doing well. Take care of yourself." One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, David reached over and took my hand. It was the first time he'd touched me in weeks, and the gesture brought tears to my eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget," he said quietly, "but I want to try. For us." I squeezed his hand, my voice trembling as I replied, "That's all I've ever wanted." It was a small step, but it felt monumental, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed us. Months later, I saw Nathan again. It was unplanned, a chance encounter at the grocery store. He looked older, more mature, but his eyes still held that same warmth that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. "Hi," I replied, my heart pounding. We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, he smiled, a sad, wistful smile, and nodded. "Take care," he said, his voice filled with a quiet finality. "You too," I replied, my chest tightening as I watched him walk away. And so I chose to keep walking, one step at a time.